get by. It resides between my eyes. Walked through the fire, came out better on the other side. See, life's like a beach if you find the sand. And right now, I feel like $100,000.
You are listening to Inspired Insider with your host, Dr. Jeremy Wise.
A vast number of entrepreneurs, because it was some way of extending our families because we'd lost families and so on. So I'm surprised that you had so much difficulty.
Yeah, I don't know, but hopefully I'll find more now that I see that maybe I was looking up survivor as opposed to the kinder transport.
Well, that's right. It just go under kinder transport.
Yeah.
There were 10 of us.
And again, like your book, Let It Go, is a must-read. So I feel like it should have been named. They had a couple. I'm curious if you had other titles there, like Trailblazer, Pioneer. What were the working titles there? I feel like if I were to name it, I would argue with Let It Go and name it Trailblazer or something like that.
But I think I'm much more sort of thinker than just a trailblazer. The Let It Go is a Buddhist principle of making sure that I don't carry with me the anger that I felt from the Nazi Holocaust days, and that you can actually move on. And it's a pun on information technology, of course, as well. I mean, I'm conscious that I've opened the door for a lot of people.
Yeah.
I'm still an early adopter of technology. I'm sort of
early adopter. Yeah. I did a lot of research. Listen to your book. I'm looking at like 25 pages of research, but I always like to know what is top of mind for you. What do you want to make sure that we discuss today?
I think this paying back. Yes, I have been successful in business, but it was 25 years before the company ever paid a dividend. It was wasn't this overnight success that some entrepreneurs are aiming for. And this giving back, I'm now a social entrepreneur. Yeah. I've set up 4 different charities, 3 of which are now sustainable. And that is as much an achievement in a slightly different format as setting up my company from which my wealth stems. Totally.
Okay. Yeah, I have a lot of those questions in here, so we'll definitely talk about that. Dr. Jeremy Wise here, founder of InspiredInsider.com, where I talk with inspirational entrepreneurs and leaders like the founders of Atari, Einstein Bagels, and many more, and how they overcome big challenges in life and business. Our sponsor today is Rise25.com, which I co-founded with my business partner, John Corcoran. Rise25 hosts in-person VIP events and masterminds for top entrepreneurs all over the country. This past year, we did events in Austin, Chicago, Santa Barbara, San Diego, New York, Sonoma, many more. We have not been to England yet. If you see the value of immersing yourself with other top entrepreneurs to connect and collaborate to get your business to the next level, go to rise25.com, contact us, and find out where our next event is going to be. It is my honor and pleasure. Today we have Dame Stephanie Shirley, known to business contacts as Steve, because in a male-dominated business world, she would sign letters with her pen name. She'd get it in the door because she found that if she signed it with Stephanie, it would go in the trash possibly. So she started adopting Steve. She has an amazing book called Let It Go, where it documents her life. It starts with her experience as an unaccompanied child refugee. Picture yourself at age 5, what you were like at age 5, and now go on a train away from your parents to a foreign city, a foreign country. What would you feel like? And that's what happened to her. And her parents wanted to protect her from perishing in the Holocaust. Her early experience of the glass ceiling at work because of gender discrimination encouraged her to set up her own business, which she did in 1962 with only, I believe, £6 at the time. And she created one of UK's first software startups. She forged the path for not only women, but the whole computing industry. And while planning to start a family, she hit on the idea of offering part-time employment to professional women with dependents. Essentially, she had pioneered freelance-driven business and wanted to be woman-owned. That's why, Dame Stephanie, I am still arguing Let It Go should be called Pioneered or something like that. But we'll get to that in a second. Essentially,
gig economy.
This is my whole argument for changing the title, or the next book may be called Pioneered. The IT business prospered with a lot of hard work. In 1996, the company was floated on the London Stock Exchange, earning hundreds of millions of pounds, and it had employed 8,500 people. She made, I believe, 70 staff into millionaires. And this wealth has enabled her to devote her time and resources to giving something back to society, and she ranks among the world's leading philanthropists. And in 2013, she appeared on BBC Radio and actually discussed why she had given away more than $67 million of her, or pounds, sorry, 67 million pounds of her own personal wealth to different projects. And she supported strategic projects in the fields of autism. Her son Giles was autistic and IT, but her focus is purely on autism, and this is via the Shirley Foundation. They facilitate scientific research aimed to understand what autism is as opposed to what it looks like. Dame Stephanie, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Now, I wanted to start off with, what life was like before you go on the train. You're pre 5 years old.
Well, I was the younger daughter of a quite bourgeois family in Dortmund, near Berlin. My father was a young judge. In Germany, you could be a judge, qualify as a judge by examination. So he was a judge at the age of 33 or at the age of 30. And in 1933, when I was born, he was fired by edict of the so-called Third Reich. And really the bad times began. But up to then, it had been, I can remember walking in the many beautiful parks that they have in that city. I can remember trivial things of a child. What I can remember very clearly is the journey itself. Yeah. And I say very clearly, Jeremy, but you sort of think, have I really got this right? Have I imagined it? Have I seen too many films of the Kindertransport? Is my memory really true? And of course, we never really know. It was quite traumatic. It was...
I have a 4-year-old, Dame Stephanie, and I can't even imagine putting her on a train, saying goodbye to her, and be like, good luck, Yeah.
Well, some families did, in fact, put their children on the train and then grab them off again. I think it was an act of most deep love for my parents to send me away into the arms of strangers, really not knowing what was happening or what was going to happen, but knowing that if I stayed in Germany, the future for Jewish families was just catastrophic. And in my current life, I come across parents of autistic children who are placing them in residential care for the first time. And it is the same, they're all traumatized. I'm able to explain to them that it is the most loving thing that they can do, to let their child go into special education. And so I try to build on those bad times and tease out what helps me in the future.
Yeah, it's almost a framing them as you are not, abandoning your child, but you are actually, it's the most loving thing you can do.
Yeah.
Talk about the 2.5 day journey. You were on the train for 2.5 days. Just so people get a sense of what that was like.
Well, the scene in Vienna main station was bedlamic. Nearly all the parents were crying. The children were crying and hysterical. I wasn't. I'm quite a controlled person and was even then. And the upset was softened by my mother, who had the insight to wrap little presents up for me so that in fact, I was much more interested, childlike, in the train going, because only when the train going was I allowed to open this little present. And I can remember that little, very special present today. It's a shame I don't still have it. So we got on the train, and my memory is of quite different train compartments to the ones that I've seen in films. I do remember children sleeping in the overhead luggage racks, and somebody queried this, and I thought, well, perhaps I've imagined that. And then I came across another Kindertransport child, and she said, yes, that did happen. So it wasn't my memory playing false. But we slept on the floor on strips of corrugated cardboard. I don't know what we ate, because maybe my mother gave us sandwiches. I just don't remember eating at all. I remember a little boy who kept being physically sick all the time. And I think I can remember that when the train had many unscheduled stops, that he got off the train and was sick in the field, a nice country field. It wasn't in a town. And yet I've read that the trains were sealed, because how else would you look after? We had 1,000 children on each train with just 2. What I would like to talk about is that in addition to those 2 adults, there were some volunteers, young girls in the main, 16 plus in age, and so not eligible to travel on the Kindertransport, but they served as volunteers to help with the younger children. And they'd come to a deal that they were allowed to do that if they guaranteed that they would return to what they must have known was almost certain death. And I always like to honour the sheer heroism of those young people. It's an amazing thing for a young girl to do, I think. So there was some of the young people. When I arrived at Liverpool Street Station in London, my recollection is that it was not only just a grey day, and then why should it be grey in July, but that it was very silent, that the platform was silent as all these hundreds of children streamed out onto the platform. And I think I was just so frozen in my emotions that I misremember it in some ways. There's a lovely statue at Liverpool Street Station of a group of Kindertransport children. And there's a child there that's about 5 years old. And you look back and you say, yeah. When I see young children, it's unbelievable.
It's baffling. Yeah, it's unbelievable. I mean, in today's day, okay, we have a cell phone. How do you even find the people that you're supposed to find among thousands of other kids?
Well, we had numbers round our neck so that people knew which compartment we were in and who we were supposed to be going to. That was well organised. I think that's the difference between the Kindertransport. It was set up by the set up by the Christian and Jewish activists. It was supported by the Quakers financially. There were masses of volunteers involved. So it was very well organised. And we did all get to the right parents in the end. But I remember waiting to be claimed. Vast hall near Liverpool Street Station, where we sat on palliasses, which you're too young to know what a palliasse is, but it's a sort of sack full of straw so that one could rest on them. And we waited to be claimed for quite some hours. So I look back and I try, Jeremy, not to be defined by that start. It's just a start of my life. It's been a very, very important motivator. It drives me today. The impact of that journey drives me today. I don't like to waste the life that was saved, and so I don't fritter my days away and try to keep some gravitas as to what I'm doing.
Puts in perspective.
Yes, I think so.
Your sister and you, did you have similar transition points? Your sister was older, right?
She was older, and we got landed with the responsibility of having her 5-year-old sister clutching her. And she was only 9 years old. So I was protected to a certain extent because I had her. She reacted in a different way. Interestingly, she went into social work as a children's officer in this country, and then went out to Australia, and in fact made a quite difference to Australian childcare practices. But she finished up actually placing the boat children from Vietnam into adoptive and foster families I can't remember the year.
60s, was it?
Must be later. But anyway, she finished up placing lost children, unaccompanied children, into homes there. Really, she also adopted a child and fostered 2 brothers, which I think was just another generation fostering 2 brothers, just as we had been fostered a generation back. And there is a sort of pattern to making sure that it also brings out this sort of nature-nurture debate.
Yeah.
Who am I? Am I the child of my natural parents, or am I the child of my foster parents? And really, I'm the child of my foster parents.
You alluded to it with the, prove your life was worth saving, like throughout, that seemed to be a theme throughout the book. Explain to people a little bit about, and use in the book termed Holocaust guilt.
When you've been through trauma such as we were, and we were let's get it in perspective. I feel very, very lucky. Lucky to be saved, but also lucky in my foster parents, because it wasn't always successful. Yeah. But somehow, as a child still, as a child already, I began to feel guilty that I had been saved. In some weird, perverse way, I felt that I was almost responsible for the atrocities that had taken place. And that's a heavy sort of load for a 6, 7, 8-year-old to
for anyone.
And that survivor guilt, which is apparently quite common, and it tends to lead to depression, and that I certainly had. I was severely depressed for a long, long time. I was suicidal a couple of occasions, and I finished up with a whole lot of 6 years of treatment at the rather renowned Tavistock Clinic. And today I'm not depressed at all. I can be sad about things, but I'm not depressed. And if the depression that follows guilt, survivor guilt, has any answer, it is really compassion. And I think it has led very clearly to my focus on philanthropy, on giving back, on making sure that I remember the good things about those difficult times. And there were many good things, good happenings, people putting their lives on the line for good reason.
Yeah.
Say that well.
And, talk about, so that moment you decide, I need to start my own business. You felt you're hitting glass ceiling. What was going on at the time?
There was an incident in the lovely little computer company I was working with where I made some suggestion and was told very brusquely by the male members, so I was the only female at the meeting, that's nothing to do with you. And I got sort of quite edgy about that and went said, well, this is a good company. I mean, I didn't have a lot of sexism there, and decided that I was going to go my own way, build up the sort of company that I wanted to work for, and I thought other women would want to work with. And so it was quite an overnight decision. I went back the following morning, gave in my notice, worked my notice out, and then sat waiting for the telephone to ring in order to start off my business. Of course, there was dead silence, and I had to learn how to market, how to sell, and so on. And it actually suited me really quite well. In business, you can do anything you like as long as it is literally legal. Yeah. And so I did lots of new things.
A lot of times, people, when they start a business, it starts off as something different than it ends up. At the time when you were starting it up, what was your vision? What service were you going to provide?
Well, I was among the first, to provide a tailor-made software service. So this was not packages. This was designing and writing and delivering and training people to use software that hadn't been written before. There were in those days no such things as programming manuals. We actually learnt on the machine itself. They were early days. People laughed at the idea of having a whole lot of women write software. They also laughed because at that time software was given away free with the hardware. And they just thought it was ridiculous. Nobody can sell software. Mm-hmm. But I didn't think I think I saw the importance of software. I was much more motivated, though, by this desire to work intellectually, professionally, effectively as a woman without having the restrictions of a male environment. And perhaps that's quite topical in these days, but there is still a great difficulty for some women today to have opportunities open to them. And certainly in my day, I'm talking about early 1960s, it was very different. I mean, they just weren't women doing this. I couldn't even open the company bank account without my husband's permission. We were very much second-class citizens, and we've gone through that. I've opened a lot of doors for other women as well.
Yeah. So, Dame Stephanie, at that day, there was not a YouTube where you can look up and figure out how to code, right? But I think you used to take night classes, right? And talk about that a little bit. Because not only were you working, now you're taking mathematics in the evening, right?
I'd always wanted to be a mathematician and solve something called Fermat's last theorem. And of course, I didn't have it in me to be so academically environment. But I needed to qualify with an honours degree in mathematics. And so I took that, studying for 6 years at night school and doing a bit of a year of statistics as well. And I made some good friends during that time. I was living in London, so started off with no friends at all. So some of those friends lasted until the current time.
How did you learn to code? I mean, that probably directly didn't teach you that, I'm assuming.
There was a bit of trial and error, but also sit with it alongside. Oh, no, you don't want to do it like that. If you do it this way, it might work quicker. And so there was a lot of interchange. And as you found ways of doing things, you tended to talk about them. And it was physically talk about them with your colleagues.
Right. The other piece, is I don't know. I want you to put things in perspective for people about what coding looked like then, right? Because now you type it directly in a computer, then it's a machine code sent by mail. So talk about the process of actually coding.
We started off with paper and pencil writing flow charts, basically defining the task to be done. If this, then that. If that, not that.
Right.
And then we would transfer that into code pretty carefully, trying not to make errors. Code being in machine code or occasionally in binary. And this, some weeks on, of course, would then be sent by mail to a data center where it would be punched onto paper cards or paper tape and then repunched in order to verify it. And eventually it would then be submitted to the computer. And the fun and skill of programming was in then getting all the errors out. We tried not to make errors, but we know that there's going to be a whole lot of correction. And life is like that. Nobody is perfect all the time. What we have to do is recover from difficulty, find different ways of doing things. And I found programming really suited my personality very well. Now I used to be quite quick and accurate.
Yeah. Listening to Let It Go, it's, you're getting on a train at 5, going through a lot of tough times. And then people see the business. It did really well in the end, but there was 25 years before you paid a dividend. And then on top of that, you're raising a family and your healthy child, then all of a sudden stops talking. And I'm like, when is this story going to get rosy? Like this is a story of really difficult times, but I think people sometimes see the end result and think, okay, this was just a path to success, and it was an overnight success. So talk about some of the hard times. It was 25 years before you paid a dividend.
Yes. You would expect me to say that the hard times were financially the hard times during the 70s recession, when we nearly went bust, and we were sort of extraordinary. I got to the stage of selling personal capital items. But in fact, the really hard times came with people. When very early on, I had a breakaway group, and now I know that most organizations have a breakaway group on average every 7 years. But this was the first time I'd met it, and I was distraught, and I was hurt, and I was really shaken to the core that this should happen to me with a colleague who, my husband was, what's the word I want? My husband was godfather to her child. I mean, this was a close developing friendship, and then she went off on her own, and it took me a long time to recover from that. Really bad time.
You said that even in the research, it basically talks about Derek being, such a core support for you.
Yes, he was.
So talk about what is some of the advice he was giving or the support he was giving throughout, because like you said, you needed him to sign to start the business, right? And I'm sure actually maybe at the time some husbands would not be supportive of that, I imagine.
Indeed not. We certainly had one colleague who, I don't think her husband even knew that she worked, because we all worked from home, and it would all be tidied away nicely before her husband came home from his traditional work activity. Repeat the question.
I mean, just some of the supportive things that to paint the picture of Derek.
Yes.
What would he do during tough times? Or
that he suggested that I use the name Steve, the nickname Steve, instead of writing letters with this double feminine of Stephanie Shirley. And it's so much more macho to sort of say Steve Shirley. That was his suggestion. When I'd be sort of mulling over, I've got this difficulty, what should I do, he would come up with suggestions. Well, didn't you meet somebody last year who had that skill? That sort of suggestion. He encouraged me. That we had one project for the Castor Oil Company, which was got into the most terrible difficulty, which I won't bore everybody with. But I was stuck with this project that was late and it was important, blah, blah, blah. It was siting oil depots. I took holiday. My husband looked after our son Giles, and in that fortnight I cleared it up. I was like a limp rag afterwards, but I did do it. Now, without him, I couldn't have got through that. And when you're building a business, you're only as good as your last job. You cannot afford for it to be late or poor quality. And I like the perfectionism of business and seeing this year is much better than last year and stuff like that.
What made you think of, you were also pioneered fixed prices at a time that was not normal?
Well, that was for different reasons. We had all these part-timers, and I was not disguising the fact that they were part-timers working from home, but I was not stressing it. So to offer fixed prices, this was the team that was going to work on it. What wasn't said is that this team was all part-time and they were remote. And so it gave a much better facade of the services that we were actually providing. And fixed prices were important externally for that reason. They also became important internally because we started to offer fixed prices internally to our freelancers. If you could do this bit of programming, we would pay so much. And that sounds very practical. It gets the two costs balanced, but it had a much more strategic impact in that it allowed less qualified people to get work because it was offered on a fixed price basis. If they took longer, if they had to take 3 weeks to train themselves before they could even start, that was their decision. And of course, that tended to empower people and led very much to a company with a collegiate, many people would say a feminine culture, where it became almost natural for it to move from a company that paid well, behaved decently to its staff, paid bonuses, but eventually moved into co-ownership. And I was inspired by the John Lewis Partnership, and I did eventually get a quarter of the company into the hands of the staff at no cost to anyone but me. And that, there was all part of that fixed price, surprisingly enough. The things that you do in business, they take time. They don't happen overnight. It was 1978 when I first thought of developing software in India. And that was to get access to a cheap workforce. It was 20 years later, in the 90s, that actually happened, by which time the incentive had moved to sort of quality workforce in short supply. So, the things that happen in business, I see as very long. The people that were important to me have been important over a long period of time. Very different from the quick, sharp way in which some business is run today, or maybe, will never be run in a long-term way.
Why was co-ownership so important to you?
With a service company, I didn't put any capital in. It was financed by my own labour and eventually a second mortgage on the family home. Right. But it seemed to me that, especially in the 70s recession, my team of freelancers were holding the company together. They were giving a facade of successful business, even though we only had 2 contracts at the time and we were down to, selling things. And they were so important in seeing me through that I felt it was only right and proper and fair. And this is what philanthropy is all about, making life fairer for people, that they should share in the wealth that they'd helped create. And so it is a bit of an ethos. It is. I was delighted to serve as the first non-executive director of the John Lewis Partnership. We did 100% staff owned, but we got a quarter of it into staff ownership, and as I say, made a lot of millionaires of many people.
Yeah, in the book they talk about that, about the millionaires that were created, but also the impact that those people had because of the money that they made, whether they started businesses or they were philanthropic also.
You mentioned that I've given away some 67 million in cash. But the largest gift I have ever given was getting 24% of the company into the hands of the staff. Right. Because the company was eventually valued at nearly $3 billion.
Wow.
And so the largest gift ever.
Yeah, that's a big gift.
It's a big gift.
How did you get your first projects? What was the first significant project that you were able to get?
I think the very first one came from my ex-employer, which is fairly classic. Mm-hmm. To do something related to what I'd been doing in employment. The next one was a company called Selection Trust in the city, and asked me to do a program evaluation review technique for them. And I can't remember any more detail of it, but I do know that it led to a whole lot of similar work. This was operational research work that had the commercial value of, it was commercially valuable, and at the same time it was intrinsically difficult and interesting to people like me. And so operations research work was a sort of compromise that suited me. Stock control was just coming into, at a scientific level, was coming in those days. So we did masses and masses of stock control for the Mars sweet company. And I can remember discussing whether it was professional to accept the goodie bags of Mars products that they gave.
The answer is always yes, right?
Well, we took it very seriously.
Oh, okay.
It was yes.
How did they find out about you? I mean, is it a referral, or because I imagine if you show up in person and it's a female-owned business, there may be some discrimination there.
Oh, I think the first contracts came from introduction. Mm-hmm. And then I learned really to market. I started trying to market to American companies because they were more used to subcontracting the sort of work that we were doing. And that led, Mars was one such. Then I was introduced, I think, to a company called Unilever, big Anglo-Dutch company. And they then introduced us worldwide. So we worked for Unilever in Thailand, Unilever in South Africa. Mm. Not vast contract, but it gave us this flavour of what we could do internationally. So we tried to exploit in a positive way the contacts that we had. Yeah. And I do assure you our work was quality stuff, otherwise we wouldn't have got it.
I mean, as you bring on more and more clients, how do you grow the staff accordingly? That's also a tough part because, now you're having to bring on more and more freelancers, right?
One of the sad things is that you go into software, because I love software and I enjoy writing it, and within a very short period of time, I'm paying other people to write the software, and I'm doing the cash flow and the legal side and mainly human resources.
Yeah. You're doing nothing when you started the business, yeah.
Very extraordinary, but it happens to everyone. And somehow if you don't make that conversion into a business person, of course you don't survive, however clever you are.
Yeah. I mean, how do you find all the staff? Because you get a Unilever project, which is all over the world, and you don't have the freelancing staff, or maybe you do, kind of infrastructure already there. How do you bring on more freelancers?
I never really had difficulty in recruiting because in the early days there was a sort of buzz among women, and a tiny mention of the company in fact, the Guardian paper brought in a flood of women from all over England who wanted to work at a professional level, a vigorous professional career, at the same time as bringing up their family. And I could pick and choose among the women because nobody else was using them. They had been trained, they'd got into the computer industry, and we had requirements such as we really only considered people who had, I think it was 6 years computer experience before we'd even look at them. So these were skilled people, and it stayed like that. And I think we were good employers. So
it was really an untapped resource.
Yeah, I was just exploiting this untapped resource.
Yeah. I saw a milestone also in the book about when you brought on a CEO. Talk about that decision. That seemed like a kind of a difficult decision at the time.
I think bringing on managers is something that most entrepreneurs manage to do. But when it actually comes to a chief executive officer who's going to actually make the decisions that as founder and owner you're used to making, that is very, very difficult. And it took me 3 goes to do it over a period of about 11 years. So it's a whole phase in the company where I was trying to really move away from it. I was working internationally to get out of the chief executive's hair. Not successful twice, very successful on the 3rd time. And this is how a lot of business is. It doesn't necessarily, unless you're absolutely brilliant, but you have to persevere with things. And it doesn't work, you still may have to try it again. And the 3rd time, they appointed a woman, now sadly dead, Hilary Cropper, who was brilliant. And she took all the good things about the company, killed some sacred cows without compunction, and made it really very, very profitable and growing in a very then professional, conventional corporate way. And that's how it floated, and that's how it was eventually acquired.
Yeah. And it seemed like, when the company was growing and you were able to actually take money out, it wasn't to buy expensive cars or houses. It was really so that you can take care of Giles.
Yes. Vulnerable children can be extremely expensive, but both emotionally and financially. It's estimated that a child like Giles costs about 10 million in his lifetime.
Wow.
10 million. And that was one of the few financial incentives that I ever had. I realized that if I was going to sort him out, I needed to do something like that. They were difficult times. A lot of people ask how I managed to build a business, which is a pretty full-time job, and at the same time rear a profoundly handicapped child. And in fact, the two sort of balanced each other for many years. The only time I forgot my son Giles was when I was working. The only time I forget work, because I am a workaholic, was when I was with Giles. And that went on for many, many years, very nicely balanced. But eventually got on top of me, and I had a good old-fashioned nervous breakdown. And Giles finished up in hospital and never came home, except that, no, that's another story. Giles finished up in hospital.
How are
you going to end all this?
What's that?
How are you going to end all this?
I mean,
I love that.
This is fantastic. I guess at the time, what did they have a good handle on what autism was? What were they thinking was going on at the time?
At that time, it was thought to be a result, a psychological result of poor parenting.
Really?
And
wow.
Oh, yeah. that didn't help either. The thought that the professionals thought you just had made this happen by not being, especially when you were working, and maybe being a mathematician isn't the best training to be a parent, and you think, is it me? And nowadays we do know that it is a brain disorder.
Sure.
And one of the charities that I set up is doing nothing but research into autism, what it is.
That I cannot believe that. So they actually said that to people at the time?
Yeah.
That it's basically your fault.
Yes.
Wow. That's traumatizing in itself.
Yes, it was pretty awful. The term used, which I'm loath to repeat because it perpetuates it, we were called refrigerator mums.
Wow.
That we were too cold, you think.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, not nice.
That's horrible. And so, with him, what was working as far as you said, you put him into a separate facility, and that was trying also.
Well, he went to school. I got him into a primary school at the age of 5, I think. And he stayed there. He should have come out at 11, but I couldn't find anywhere else for him. So he stayed there till he was about 13. And then I couldn't find any schooling for him whatsoever. So he stayed at home with me. And that was the route, really, to disaster. And as I say, he finished up in hospital and would have stayed there had not he begun to lose some of his human rights and triggered, really, my setting up the first charity.
Because towards the end, it seemed
Giles,
like... What's that?
Giles was the first resident in the first home of my first charity.
Right. It seemed at the end...
Sorry.
No, I said it seemed at the end that there was, when you were set that up, it was helping. It was progress.
Yes, it was. Was it progress? I think we felt, there was nothing else we could do. We have to try this now. It wasn't set up as a charity to begin with, because until you have 3 residents, you can't just make a charity of looking after your own son. Bad times.
Yeah. And so talk about the Shirley Foundation and what you're doing with the Shirley Foundation.
My mission, and I'm quite clear about this, is to be pioneering, never more of the same, no matter how worthy, and to be strategic. So it's not just helping this person or that group, but something that will actually have an impact long term on a whole sector. And so the big contracts, it's the word I want, social philanthropy, really, venture philanthropy. So the first organisation, which started just with Giles, now looks after 143 people and keeps an overview of another 100, and that's today, and it's growing. The second one is the biggest one I've ever done, which is a school which now employs 600 people, looking after 100 pupils, has a young adult centre taking students from 19 to 25, and that is of world renown now. I used to think the company would be my legacy, but that's not going to happen. It's changed its name. It's owned by somebody else. I no longer think of it as that's my legacy. I do think of the school as going to be my legacy. It's a charity. I do expect it to be there in 100 years' time. And the third charity is Autistica, which funds medical research. And that is now 10 years old or something like that. And I'm enormously proud of it, because that really is addressing some of the issues, getting people interested in research, getting people to contribute to research, because that has to be the long-term good future.
What's been some innovations with Autistica or just the research in general? What have you found is what's progressed?
Typical of the study is work looking at mental health in autism and why a large number of people with autism commit suicide, why people with autism die 14 years earlier on average than people without autism. Now, these are big questions that are real in the real world that make a difference to families. So we set up an autism brain bank, which is now the largest brain bank in the world, because the American one, something went wrong with it and it absolutely failed and it's useless now. People's brains are very, very valuable material to researchers. There's still things that you can only do post-mortem, and they do tell you a lot about autism. I started looking at the economics of autism. That was in 1997, and employed a university department to actually work out what is the cost of autism, and I think I've mentioned it. The cost to a family is 10 million. Wow. The cost from the nation's point of view is now 32 billion a year, and that's mainly in lost employment. Because if we could, and we're working on this, get people into employment, even though they are autistic, that would make a tremendous difference to that financial 32 billion a year.
Dame Stephanie, has anything interesting stick out to you that's come out of the Autism Brain Bank?
I think it's all too technical for me.
Yeah.
I think I don't know what they do with it.
Yeah.
It's been used for something like, what they say, 1,000 experiments so far, which is, the sort of measures that a philanthropist does. It is in use. I also set up the Oxford Internet Institute. And that was a way of trying to give back to the sector from which my wealth stems some of the money. And that now is of world renown. I was on their advisory board for 10 years. And it's just great. And I just bask in the reflected glory of some of the work that they do there. Very good.
I want to talk about just the future for a second. You have a lot of wisdom in the business field and in innovating the research and the caring of autism. What, business-wise, as far as the future of technology, you're talking to a founder of a company. What things should they be thinking about for the future?
It has to be artificial intelligence. The sort of robots that I was using in a factory production environment 50 years ago now means that we have robots that can be colleagues, robots that can be expert systems. They can deal with the annual reports. The whole administration of business is very largely going to be be done by robots. I'm using a robot to teach autistic children, and I don't design the thing or anything like that, but it's marvelous to see what a robot can do. Not just cheaper, not just better, but do things that people can't do. And that's the exciting way that it's moved on.
And then what should people be doing to help the future of autism?
I should have known that you're going to ask this question.
I mean, it shouldn't just be on your shoulders, right? I mean, you've done a lot. You've set up a lot of charities and foundations and research and care facilities. But, if someone's listening, let's say their family member or child has autism, what should they be doing?
The big thing that I think people should be doing is learning to appreciate that autism is a different way of looking at the world. It's not just a disorder, a disease, all those names that we used to use, all those terms that we used to use 50 years ago. But we now realize that people with autism see the world differently. They have different sensory systems. Their brains work differently. We can see that with some of the brain work, studies that's going on. And it then becomes a matter of diversity, that people with autism should have the same or similar opportunities as you or I do, opportunities for education. My Giles was considered to be ineducable. Nobody tried to educate him. That view of autism as just different, not a discrepancy, just different. Yeah. And that's what's going to make a lot of difference.
Yeah. So I have one last question. This has been absolutely fantastic. I just want to thank you so much. I have one last question, but before I ask it, I want to point people towards where they should find some of these resources online. I know they can go and Let It Go, get it on Amazon or Audible or wherever you can get the book, Let It Go. Where else should we point people towards online?
We have a Steve Shirley website.
Okay.
Steve.com.
SteveShirley.com.
SteveShirley.com. Okay.
One word, SteveShirley.com. The National Autistic Society.
Autistica.
Autistica.com also?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So we go SteveShirley.com, Autistica.com.
No, Autistica is .co.
Is that .org.uk?
.org.uk.
.org. Okay. Well, look up Autistica and check it out.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Check it out. I highly recommend everyone get and read or listen to the book, Let It Go. It's fantastic. It will change.
You also look at my TED Talk.
What's that?
Have you seen my TED Talk? Have you seen my TED
Oh, yeah,
Talk?
of course.
Well, then we should tell people to
Yeah,
look at that.
you can go to the TED Talk on YouTube or it's probably on your site too. It's not. It doesn't do the same justice though as the book, right? I mean, that's like 13 minutes. But if you're lazy and you don't want to, you should read the whole, listen to the whole book. Then you can watch the TED Talk, which is about 13 minutes.
Let me ask you: did you listen to it or did you read it?
I listened to it.
Interesting.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I love listening.
Will be a film, Tony.
There'll be a film?
There will be a film coming out. Yes, they're starting next year. I don't know what it's going to be called yet, but looking forward to that.
Okay, awesome. Then everyone, if you're listening, look out for the film as well. Do we know the name yet, or is it remains to be? No.
Revealed. To be revealed.
To be revealed. Okay. Name to be revealed. So I always like to end with Inspired Insider with two questions, which is one, what's been a low point and how you push through? And we've talked about a couple. And then what's been a proud moment for you?
I think the low point I've already mentioned when I had a breakaway group. It really took me down into the depths. And the high point is again to do with people. When I took the company into co-ownership, I was enormously thrilled about that. I don't think people realized how important it was, but I was thrilled. It had taken me a long time. I still get on platforms and talk about my co-ownership, what we did. And that certainly was a high point for me.
Yeah. I want to be the first one to thank you, Dame Stephanie Shirley. It's been an absolute pleasure and honor. So thank you very much.
Lovely to meet you.
What I got, you can't buy. It resides between my eyes. Walked through the fire, came out better on the other side.